In the last video, we introduced the aggregate supply curve. We also introduced how the aggregate demand curve crosses that supply curve to find the economy's product market equilibrium. Well, if you've heard the economy's product market equilibrium a few times, it's because we've been talking about it in the last couple lessons. Only in some of the last stuff, you saw that as where we were finding the equilibrium between spending and output, and we were using that Contingent Cross. So that Contingent Cross, and using that Contingent Cross and finding where that output will equal that spending, and using that aspect of calculating that aggregate expenditures and finding where that aggregate expenditures at that specific point where output equals spending, and doing that through the Contingent Cross, that represents one view of equilibrium in the economy's product market. Another one that we have is finding the intersection of the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve. So in the last video, we were kind of talking about that and drawing that aggregate demand curve to show us how prices change, what businesses are going to do in terms of what is that going to do to the aggregate output. So the intersection of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, it'll show the economy's product market equilibrium. It's showing the amount that is being supplied. What is that amount that is being supplied? And what is the amount that is being demanded? So it's where this aggregate supply is showing the amount that's being supplied at a specific price or at a series of prices versus the amount that's being demanded at a series of prices. And where those two intersect, that is our equilibrium. Because it's showing that at this particular price, at this specific price right there, the amount that is being demanded equals the amount that's being supplied, which in a sense means you're producing the exact amount that people are going to be buying. So in this particular graph, this occurs right here at output of YE, Y equilibrium. Now this YE is going to be the exact same value, exact same output as what you would find as where the aggregate expenditures crosses at 45-degree ray from the origin of that Contingent Cross. So that aggregate output, that aggregate equilibrium output that you find up here in the Contingent Cross will be the same one that we're going to be finding right there. Those two numbers equal each other. And what we're doing is this is using these aggregate demand and aggregate supply, these two lines, and where those two lines intersect is just simply another way of finding that nation's product market equilibrium. And that's all it is. And all it's doing is it's saying at this output, that is where our nation's income is going to equal our nation's output in terms of value. And that's where we are in equilibrium. So let's go ahead and talk about this graph real quick and what all is on this graph. First and foremost, you have aggregate output down here on the bottom. You have price level over here on the side, on this vertical edge, aggregate output on this horizontal line. You also have the aggregate supply curve. This aggregate demand curve, you have this YE. That YE stands for the equilibrium level of the nation's product market, or what is that economy's product market equilibrium output. Then you also have this YFE. And that YFE is going to become pretty stinking important here in a little bit as we're talking about recession or inflation gaps. So the nation's YFE is the nation's full employment output. It's saying that at this price level right here and at this output right here, it's at that point when the nation is in full employment. Everybody that's looking for a job is working. We have everybody that wants to work is working, and we are in full employment of that nation. This is the economy's maximum non-inflationary level of goods and services. And it's when it's operating at a natural rate of employment. So it's right here where is right before we get into major levels of inflation whenever we have an economy at full employment. Whereas this YPOT, this YPOT is the economy's potential GDP. So the things to remember off this graph is this might be the nation's equilibrium, and this is the nation's full employment. So if we are in, what it's saying right here is we could actually increase the equilibrium. If the aggregate demand would increase, then we could actually hire more people. But it's once you get to this point, the nation is at full employment, and everybody that wants to work is working. And the only way to increase past the full employment is by simply having the people that are already employed work longer. Now we're pulling in overtime. Now we're pulling in extra shifts. Now we are working 2 jobs instead of just 1. And that's across the whole nation. Everybody's putting in extra hours, and that'll increase our output until we get to this Y potential. And that's whenever we're maximizing out our resources. That's our economy's total potential GDP. That's where we could. But that means people are working overtime. They're working a lot harder than they're used to or than they want to, because that's above that full employment level. And this is the economy's maximum non-inflationary level of goods and services. Because as soon as we get past this point, people are going to be making a lot more money, which means that they are going to be driving up prices, and that as aggregate demand rises, say from there to there, we have a large increase in prices, which is leading into this inflationary level of goods and services. So, quick recap. It's the nation's equilibrium, nation's full employment, and nation's potential GDP if they're maximizing out all of their resources.